All right, so since we have some people that are out, I'm going to record this real quick. The beginning of this is going to go by fairly quickly because it's review. Yes, the sun, Arabella, is the main source of energy in the ecosystem. That is something that you very well could see show up. That's a question that they love to ask. The sun also happens to be the main source of energy for the water cycle and for weather when we get into that. Next, moving on, we're going to talk about food chains and food pyramids, especially getting into the food pyramid today. We know that a food chain is just the path of energy, and a food chain can be very, very simple. Grass to grasshopper to bird to owl. There's not a lot of things to interpret in that food chain, although you do need to know what is the producer, what is the consumer, what is the herbivore, what is the carnivore in that scenario, or even an omnivore if it happens to be in that, because that's something that's very, very important as well. So it's just something to think about when we're looking at food chains. Now, we know from the last time when we went through these that when we're looking at food chains, the big thing is what is going to happen when we add a very specific thing to the food chain or take something away with a limiting factor. For example, I'm going to change the question in this one. What would happen if a farmer used pesticides on their crops? Well, that means you have to know what pesticide means. That means you have to actually be paying attention in class, which some of us are not. What would happen if a farmer in this food chain used pesticides on their crops? I have one person awake today. Maddie, what would happen? It's something that kills the pests or the bugs that might eat the plant. If the bugs die in this scenario, then what? Or what's going to suffer if there's not a lot of bugs in this scenario? I think the first thing would be the birds, right? They have less food because the insects start to die. Or even possible, Kaylee, like they eat the insects that have eaten that poison and the birds themselves get sick, which is something that has happened that we'll see in some videos that we'll talk about today, which is extremely important. So I don't necessarily think that there's going to be like anything like what is a food chain and then the definition. That's not going to be on the test. There will be food chains, and they are going to change, Reese, one of the limiting factors on there, and they're going to ask you what's going to happen if. So that's something that we need to get very, very used to before we get to that point of taking the test about food chains and food webs. Food webs. We know that food webs, if we look, I'll have to drag this into the screen here. There we go. They can see it at home now. Food webs obviously get very difficult later on. I mean, that is a lot of crisscrossing arrows. And I understandably could get confused trying to track where all those arrows go. And then, Landon, it's even worse if you think the arrow means that it eats. Because then you're saying that small plants eat small fish, and that's not the way that works. What does the arrow in a food chain mean? What are the words that we can substitute? Gives energy to. It's something that we can substitute for that arrow. So you got to think about that as we go through, as we're looking at different food webs. And the food webs are no different, Angel. They're going to ask you what happens if, and they're going to take a scenario on any of those things and expect you to figure out where those dominoes are falling, right? If I take out the caterpillar, probably not going to affect the owl, is it? I mean, I don't see how the owl and the caterpillar are affected. However, if I take out the blackberries, it probably would affect the owl because all of a sudden now the mouse has less food, which could affect the owl. So you have to be able to follow the path that those dominoes might fall if something were to happen in that ecosystem. I told you that I was going to go home and look this up. I went home and looked this up, and we do need to look a little bit more in depth into the energy pyramid or the energy triangle. And we do need to learn very specific words from the bottom of the pyramid to the top of the pyramid. And we will do that here in just one moment. If you want to go ahead and draw a fairly large triangle, Inslee, because we're going to be putting a lot of notes in the triangle. I'm talking like probably half the page of the notes. Half a page is probably what I would have to do. We're going to talk about the layers of this triangle, and we're going to move up. I know that if I put the entire triangle up here right now, all you're going to do is write all the words down and you're not going to listen, which is not what we need to do. I do need you to understand that if we draw a triangle or a pyramid, either way you want to look at it, that the base of that is the largest part. I don't think anybody in here is shocked by that. But when we're looking at an ecosystem, what is there more of out there than anything? Are there more trees and plants outside, or are there more butterflies and bees? More plants, and that's why plants, or the fancy word that they use, producers, makes up the bottom portion of my triangle. I'm going to go ahead and let you write that down. I'm going to pause the notes because I'm going to go ahead and draw this out on the anchor chart today as well during this class, and that should be good. All right, now we're going to move up one level. And Liam, right above the producers is the first thing to eat. And we are going to call them, there's two words that we can use for them. First level consumers, which makes sense, they're the first thing to consume. Or you might hear them called, now put this to the side, primary consumers. Those mean the exact same thing. First level consumers and primary consumers. Now, Inslee, a lot of the times you'll see in this first level consumer thing where it's herbivores. And that does make a lot of sense to me. It doesn't have to be an herbivore, but a lot of the times you're going to see herbivores in this picture. When we look at the picture on Nearpod, if I go back to that, I see rabbits there, and those are obviously herbivores, but it doesn't have to be. Just the majority of the time it is. So again, if the first thing to eat, energy from the producers go to here, it's called the first level consumer. Now, these first level consumers, they're going to give energy to the second level consumers, and sometimes you see the word secondary used in play. It might call it a secondary consumer or a second level consumer. All right, Charlotte, here we go. Producers, the first thing to eat is first level consumer. The second thing to eat is second level consumer. What would you call the third thing that eats? I think she's ignoring me. She doesn't want to answer. First level consumer, second level consumer. What would you call the third thing that eats? It probably is a carnivore, but if we're following the pattern of first level, second level, third level consumer. If I can get this thing to move. Third, you're gonna see the top. Third level consumer, and then we have fourth level consumer. Now they do have a very weird word for the third level consumer. Primary is definitely different for first. Secondary, you should not miss that one. This word is tertiary. Tertiary. Now, Reese, I really hope that they just go with first, second, third, and fourth, but I've seen them throw primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary in there. But listen, secondary, no one should miss. Tertiary starts with a T, that's the third. Quaternary is almost cuatro, which is Spanish for four, right? Or quad, which you might see in there would be like more of a Latin and Greek prefix on that. Those aren't hard. I really hope they stick with producers first, second, third. And we see, oh, whoops, I closed the wrong thing. We see that like today, that they used first level consumers and second level consumers on the test, right? I mean, this is straight from a test. They use those words in there, which is fine. All right, we'll pause that. Let us finish out the triangle. If you want to go ahead and knock it out to third level and fourth level consumers, that's fine. All right, so we've talked about the food and energy pyramid. So these next few slides just reinforcing that. Again, each layer of the pyramid has more energy than the next. So obviously the bottom is where most of the energy is. We don't need to know the math of how the energy changes as it moves to the top. Producers, first level consumer, second level consumer, third level consumer, fourth level consumer. I don't even think we need to know those fancy words. Hopefully we don't have to do that as we move along. We're not doing that today. That's the calories. Don't worry about that. All right. Limiting factor. We did this last week because I skipped the pyramid and got to here. I wanted to make sure I had to actually teach all those layers, and we did. Limiting factors. These are things that control whether a population grows or dies. Right? Now, I think about what's in the window. As we look at limiting factors, and we took those notes last week, there are 4 that show up, Liam. These 4 words show up in questions, and I need you to know what these 4 things mean. I know that we covered invasive species last week, and that's where it stopped. Invasive species are plants or animals that are not native that start to take over an area and start to negatively affect the populations of other plants and animals. And we watched the video about those pythons in the Florida Everglades and about the kudzu, which we see here. Next, pesticides. Pesticides is not something that we have in our notebooks, but you need to put in there today. They are chemicals that are used to kill bugs or pests. Chemicals that are used to kill. We'll come back and watch this video here in just a moment. Fertilizer. Fertilizer is something that you add to the soil, you spray on the plants, and it helps the plants grow. I don't need to write this down exactly like that. Put it in your own words. Yes? I'll bring it up here. Let me look at it. Fertilizer, a substance that is added to the soil. It's sprayed on plants to help them grow. So one more time for my folks that are at home watching this video. I am not writing all of this. I am just going to use that. Something that pollutes is a pollutant. Because if you pollute something, you've already contaminated it. It's the same thing. It's redundant. Something that pollutes. I just need you to know what pollutants are. Whether it's the fog and things coming out of the back of cars, the factory that's over there put different chemicals into the air, or you've changed the oil on your Jeep in your driveway and you spill some oil and you don't clean it up properly and the rain comes and washes it off down your backyard into a creek. Still polluting. Still polluting. So I am going to stop the notes for the people at home there. I have heard that we don't talk about threatened and endangered and extinct anymore. Well, we don't have to teach the vocabulary words. I'm still going to go over that because I do want you to know about those. We just don't have to spend as much time on it, which is kind of awesome if they're taking some vocabulary off of our plate. But again, very much like the triangle, I'm going to dig into that to make sure I'm not incorrect before I completely skip something. So for the folks at home, hope they got all that. Smash the like button and subscribe.